What is up, you guys? Welcome back to Gaylag Archipelago, episode 4. I'm Sam. Today we're going to be discussing the life of LGBT people in the German Socialist Movement in the Communist German Democratic Republic. As the region basically began to consolidate under Prussian rule, a rising socialist movement sought power and change with the homosexual rights movement. This came to a dramatic halt as Germany was taken over by Nazis in the eventual playout of World War II, only for Germany to become split after the war into a capitalist West and communist East, which resulted in great differences not only for working people, but also the LGBT community. This would later end with the collapse of the Berlin Wall and later reunification of Germany under the rule of capitalism. So in this episode, it's going to be kind of broken down into 4 key periods. And the first of which is the unification of Germany and the rise of gay rights, which is from 1850-ish to 1923. Where we'll discuss unifying Germany and the emergence of a socialist movement and the world's first gay rights movement, which is pretty cool. The second period is Nazis, World War II, and the splitting of Germany, which is from 1924 to 1948. And we'll discuss a struggling post-World War Germany and how that leads to Nazi power and a Second World War, only to have the clock wound back for not only the socialist movement, but also the gay rights movement that advanced earlier. The third period is going to be on the Communist GDR and the advancements of LGBT rights, which is from 1949 to 1987. We'll discuss the creation of Communist East Germany and the many surprising advancements achieved for working class people and LGBT people in the country. And then we'll conclude with the fall of the Berlin Wall and the reunification of Germany, which is 1989 to present, where we'll discuss why Communist East Germany collapsed and the result of a unified capitalist state and its role in creating a neoliberal European Union. So let's get started. So we're going to start in the late 1800s. So basically Germany, like a lot of Western Europe, was industrialized, though unlike many of Germany's neighbors, they still had some holdovers from feudalism, which basically limited their success in acquiring colonies throughout the global south, unlike the rest of Europe, like France and the United Kingdom. And also Germany at the time was kind of around 300 different, we'll call them countries. I don't really know what to call them, but we'll call them countries. And while most of these 300, or many of these 300 countries didn't have laws against same-sex love, Prussia, who was actually taking over the little countries pretty fast, had a pretty repressive laws on the topic. And that kind of leads to the first big case. In 1862, lawyer Jean-Baptiste von Schweitzer was prosecuted for basically doing some man-on-man love in a park. He was also a member of the Socialist German Workers Association, who basically had a discussion after he was arrested of whether or not they should kick him out. Because remember, not everyone was woke as fuck back then. Though despite the people wanting to kick him out, the leader, Ferdinand Lassalle, defended him, and he wasn't expelled. And actually, when the former leader who defended him died, Schweitzer became the president of the socialist organization, which is pretty impressive, knowing this is way before America did anything. Despite all of that, in the 1860s, Prussia was basically discussing passing a harsher penal code for homosexuality because they suck. But in 1864, a gay man named Karl Ulrichs in the city-state of Hanover was like, fuck this, Prussia's about to take over our region, and I'm not going to deal with this. At the time, there was not a term for being gay or homosexual, so he created his own term in 1962 for male attraction to males, which he called Urning, which I'm going to spell it out for you because you might know what I'm talking about. It's Urning. But that was the term at the time, so it wasn't always gay or homosexual, guys. And basically he led a campaign against Prussian law, which lasted 30 years, which emerged into the first gender and sexuality rights movement in the world in 1969. While that was going on, in 1868, Marxist and leader of the German Social Democratic Party, Edward Bernstein, actually wrote a defense of known gay Oscar Wilde in a popular left newspaper that circulated for the country. He also called for socialists to lead the way on sexual reform and to reject the increasing pathologized treatment of same-sex attraction. That's a hard word to say, guys. I have a lisp.
Hi, it's Gianna. Pathologization, Sam. That's that word you were trying to say.
It's hard to say.
It is hard to say.
But anyways, thanks for the cut in, Gian. In 1869, Hungarian Dr. Bernhardt, the inventor of the term homosexuality, actually wrote a letter defending gay rights to the German Minister of Justice, basically siding with people who were like, this is bullshit. And in 1871, Prussia finally fucking did it, and they passed the anti-gay paragraph 175 to the Penal Code, which basically prohibited male-on-male behaviors. I'll let you imagine what that all means. But in 1897, in response to this, the Scientific Humanitarian Committee became the first German gay liberation org, founded by a gay Jewish doctor named Magnus Hirschfeld. He also coined the term transvestite, which I know a lot of people think is a bad term, but back then it did not have the pejorative meaning we have today. And he did extensive writing and research on cross-dressing because some people say he was a cross-dresser or transvestite as well, so he was part of that community. The org also did extensive education and campaigning to decriminalize homosexuality across Europe, and that included the repeal of paragraph 175. And that kind of shows in 1898, the committee, which I'm going to refer to them as for the rest of the episode because I don't want to keep saying their name, brought 900 signatures of doctors, lawyers, and scientists to Parliament in Germany to get them to repeal 175. It was sadly rejected because they suck, but it had a support from the small socialist minority who were part of the Social Democrats Party. And actually, after this action, Hirschfeld became a member of the Social Democrats until the Nazis seized power and he never returns, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But in 1905, the committee tries again, this time with 5,000 signatures, including socialist leaders and prominent figures, including people like Albert Einstein and Leo Tolstoy. And it was rejected again. But in 1910, the anti-gay reactionaries kind of got sick of this shit and basically forced many of the organizers underground, and many German politicians were subjected to an anti-gay witch hunt. If they were gay or not, didn't really matter, was used to silence them. And actually, Parliament began to discuss the persecution of lesbians. And I know in the episodes prior, we don't really talk about lesbians, but that's because before, no one actually thought women had sexualities. So they just kind of ignored them. So that's why it's only being brought up now, because they think they're actual people who have sexualities. I promise in future episodes, we'll talk more about lesbians. But either way, this unified the women's liberation struggle that was happening throughout Germany with the homosexual struggle, because many lesbians were also part of the women's movement. Despite some of these bumps, in 1910, Hirschfeld did convince Berlin police to accept, we'll call them transvestite certificates, which were basically signed by a doctor, and they would prevent people who broke gender norms for dress, so they wouldn't get arrested by police, which is pretty awesome. But in 1914, World War I kind of derails the socialist movement and the gay movement, with many of them splitting, including many socialists and gays, like the Social Democrats, supporting the war. This created a division between the working class, between people like Rosa Luxemburg, who was a socialist, who did not support the capitalist war, and as a result, the Social Democrats killed her in a mob. If you ever hear about Social Dems being hated on by Marxists, this is why it's usually happened, because they fucking killed them. But that was, whatever. But it did derail worker struggles, but the increasing death and suffering accelerated from the World War actually accelerated worker struggle, and the Bolshevik Revolution ignited it, and it basically led to an even more revolutionary Communist Party emergence, so basically more radical than the Social Dems. And this kind of ignites in 1918 when a mutiny again in the German Navy broke out. And this basically led to nationwide worker rebellion. And we saw this in examples like the Republic of Bavaria and a Socialist Republic in Berlin emerging, created by workers and soldiers and peasants. And the gays and lesbians were behind this shit because they're like, this could be our path to liberation. Germany basically shifted from royal control at this point to a de facto republic. And in the next year, in 1919, Germany becomes an official republic. They create the position of a president, and also having a national assembly meet in the city of Weimar, which created a new constitution. And this is basically the creation of the Weimar Republic. If you're familiar with gay rights in Germany, this is kind of like where it emerges. On the other hand, the Republic of Bavaria, which we mentioned earlier, sought a more radical communist state, kind of replicated on the Soviet method, like Russia. And this was sadly short-lived and overturned by the German military and the paramilitary group called Freikorps a month later, basically resulting in, I think it was around 1,000 communists and anarchists to be executed by the Social Dem government. And they incorporated Bavaria into the Weimar Republic, and also created a big distrust of leftist power in Bavarian people, who basically only experienced chaos and censorship and shortages from the conflict and war. And if you go to Germany today, Bavaria is one of the most conservative parts. But basically, this created a split between the Socialist Party or Social Dems and the Communist Party. And this would later create an opening for the Nazis to take power, because they're splitting the vote on one side, and the Nazis are like, well, people are pissed. They want shit to be done. And actually, many of the people who were part of the Freikorps paramilitary became prominent leaders in the Nazi party. So don't fund paramilitary groups, guys. But despite the Weimar's opposition from the far left communists and the right wing, the country did make many labor, welfare, and democratic policy advancements. They added an 8-hour workday. They created national health insurance, and they had universal suffrage for adults over the age of 20, which is just a little bit of what they did, but it's pretty cool. Gay rights also had an advancement in this time. The committee we mentioned earlier created the Institute for Sexual Science, because new laws basically eliminated censorship and allowed greater press and speech freedom. They actually built their office in the former palace of Prince Hatzfeld, who was removed by the revolution, which is pretty cool. And the Institute basically did massive historic and scientific research on human sexuality and gender. And they also housed the Scientific Humanitarian Committee for their meetings and stuff. It also became a really popular spot for socialist groups around the world to visit and inform themselves on homosexuality and other sexual questions, including Soviet doctors, which, if you remember in the first episode on the USSR, that's where they visited. They went to Germany. Super cool. In 1920, the Versailles Treaty officially ends World War I and basically leads the ground way for the rise of the Nazi Party, because the US, England, and France were basically the ones who redrew Europe, and they basically created Germany in a way that increased national hatreds within the region, splitting the working class. The Allies also forced Germany to pay a lot of reparations, which all got pushed onto the working class versus the capitalists and bankers who wanted the war. It was a capitalist war, you guys. So that fucking sucked. The workers were pissed. And then the government, to pay for shit, basically kept printing money and led to massive inflation, basically destroying our economy. So workers are mad, you guys. This is not a good time. But despite this, post-war, there was a big expansion of gay and lesbian spaces and advocacy. Basically, it was called the Gay Golden 20s in Germany, primarily in Berlin. I mean, in Berlin alone, there was around 60 spots for lesbians to congregate and socialize and drink, and there was even a lesbian magazine. So one can only imagine how many gay spots there were. Trans people also had their certificates all over the country, so they could cross-dress and not be arrested. The golden era also resulted in a lot of visibility in popular culture. So things like the creation of films like Different from Others, which was a tale of a gay violinist driven to suicide. Not a happy story, but it also had Hirschfeld, the doctor guy, star in it as a sexologist, which is kind of fun. He had a few roles during the time. Though many problematic representations did exist because it's not a woke time, guys. But there was protest out a lot of these feelers, and actually many of them got them to stop showing films that basically mocked gay men as like effeminate losers. And they were effective in like changing the way they were portrayed in the media. Cities like Berlin's openness also brought many gays from countries like England, where it was far less tolerant, and people like gay British writer Christopher Isherwood basically lived in the city from 1929 to 1933 because of his numerous amount of male hustlers available to him, but also far advanced gay rights compared to his homeland, where I'm pretty sure they were still being arrested. In 1921, Berlin hosted the first Congress of the World League for Sexual Reform to push these ideas. And by 1923, there was over 25 gay, lesbian, and trans organizations. And there was actually even a talk of them joining together to create a national homosexual political party. They did not do that, but that's pretty crazy that even was like an idea. Despite this, German fascism starts to really gain momentum because of the struggling economic conditions. And they start targeting the gay movement, which isn't good. People like Hirschfeld was assaulted multiple times by Nazis and even had one of his talks shot up by one of the Nazi supporters. He was not murdered, so that was good, but other people got shot, which is bad. In 1928, on the opposite side, the growing Communist Party actually starts calling for the repeal of paragraph 175 to decriminalize same-sex interactions. Despite that, Nazis basically gained power, and in 1933, the fascist youth trashed the Institute for Sexual Science, which basically destroys the largest collection of books and research and photographs on human sexuality on the planet. They burned it all, so it's gone forever. Sad. Luckily, Hirschfeld was on tour at the time, so he was not like beaten up or killed, but he chose to never return and died in exile. The Nazis also dismantled all of the youth groups in the country, calling them homosexual degenerates, and they began raiding gay bars led by, funnily enough, fascist, open homosexual Ernst Röhm. And I know you're all like, wait, why would a gay person be a Nazi? It's because he had class interests. The Nazis were like the tool for the capitalists to gain more power. So he was acting in his material interest. But he was later shot in 1934 because they were worried he might take power from Hitler. So, yeah. And also his role being so high in the Nazi party led to many socialists in Germany and the Soviet Union to take on some not so great gay narratives. It's where the Soviet Union kind of shifted on gays because they tied fascism with being gay. So not good, but yeah. And in 1935, Nazis officially banned all gay gathering spaces, and they also expanded the criminalization of homosexuality with paragraph 175A, which criminalized kisses, embraces, and then the vague term of gay fantasies. So things like just looking at someone a certain way could put you in jail because they're like, oh, you're checking them out. You're having bad thoughts in your head. Shit like that. It's crazy. It's basically thought police. And in 1936, Nazi Heinrich Himmler creates the Federal Security Office for Combating Homosexuality and Abortion. Despite the far reach for this organization, they had no authority over the military. So many gay men actually chose to join the military, like the Nazi military, because it was one of the safest options for them, which is like crazy.
Wait, it was the German army, right? Not the Nazi military.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Sorry, it's Gian again. I'm just, like I've already cut in once in this episode. So now I'm no longer staying silent.
Yeah.
But the German army is not not the Nazi military. It was under Nazi political control. But
That's
they
what
were
I meant.
separate, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Good. I'm glad we had this talk, Sam.
And also because in the future, from like 1933 to 1944, gays just start getting rounded up. Around 63,000 males were convicted of homosexuality, and that also included 4,000 children. And while lesbians were still never codified as being like illegal, they were also persecuted, and basically estimates for like the Nazi reach of persecution of gay, lesbian, and trans people wearing the pink triangle during the Holocaust. It's estimated to be around 100 to 600,000 people. It's kind of hard to tell because it turns out they destroyed a lot of the bodies and evidence, but very sad. And then in 1939, Germany invades Poland, and that ignites World War II. So I'm not going to go into World War II because I think you've all learned about it enough in high school and shit. So we're going to skip that. And in 1945, the Soviet Red Army and the Allies, which includes the U.S., defeat the Nazi state, and World War II is ended. Yeah, that's good. Nazis are bad. And in July 1945, the Potsdam Conference was attended by Allied countries, which basically split Germany into 4 controlled zones, 3 of which were given to the imperialist powers, U.S., Britain, and later France, and then 1 was given to the Soviet Union. So during this time, for the next 4 years, the Soviet region basically focused on eliminating the Nazis, removing the bourgeois class, who all were like tied to Nazis mostly, from power, which was a big process. This denazification period did lead to a major shift for the gay scene because many gays were able to come out of hiding, and the ones that were not genocided were able to return from the concentration camps, and gay bars basically reopened across East and West Germany. And in regards to getting rid of Nazis and their influence, the East actually was far better than the West, who was actually financed by the Marshall Plan, which was the U.S.-backed financial system, and they kind of still permitted thousands of Nazi war criminals to emigrate or to even re-enter the political arena and industry, as they were a major anti-communist force because they care more about their class interest than like ideological purity. They just don't want communism, guys. But the East didn't do that. They were pretty adamant in getting rid of these fuckers. Despite that, from 1948 to 1960s, Stalinism was kind of like the top influence in the global communist movement. And as a result, LGBT topics kind of lost their place in public debate. Despite all that, gay Germans did see a close return to pre-Nazi conditions for them, their living standards. And parts of that were because of just denazification. In 1948, East Germany struck down the Nazi anti-gay law, paragraph 175A, which West Germany didn't do until 1969. Much later, But though Prussian Law 175 remained on the books on both sides, which made gay sex punishable by 4 years. Still an improvement. Thought crimes probably worse still. While that's happening and the East is denazifying, in 1949, the Council of Europe is formed to overcome nationalism and create a greater united Europe, and focus on whatever the fuck democracy and human rights meant at the time. And they kind of ignored economic stuff. And West Germany basically joins a year later because they're capitalists, and capitalists got to become friends. In 1949, the U.S. and the Western imperialists officially split Germany, creating the West German nation. And as a consequence, they created East Germany. The GDR was established officially, and they started forming a socialist economy. The goal at the time was basically to overcome massive poverty and hunger caused by World War II. And sadly, the Soviets were one of the worst hurt nations. They had like 26 million people, I think, murdered in World War II. And they had a lot of their economy actually destroyed. So they were unlimited funds. Unlike the U.S., who didn't really see bombs all over their nation. They also had to rebuild all their institutions and overcome an entire generation of Nazi-educated children, as well as make sure everyone has jobs and education and healthcare and housing. And East Germany also had greater losses and was less industrialized than the West, and actually had less land and labor force than the West. They had around 1/3 of the land in the East and only 17 million people compared to 63 million people in the West. So they have a lot of challenges to overcome. Despite that, the LGBT movement at this point does see some revival, but they're pretty much devastated from the Holocaust and kind of silence from the more conservative Soviet stance, which had some influence in the GDR. The country was also like heavily influenced by years of Nazi anti-gay propaganda. So it's a lot to overcome and really important to keep in mind of. But despite that, 1949 to 1961, we kind of see the gay scene in both Germanys is on record of being very similar. Gays would cross the line to visit clubs in the East and the West, though many in the GDR actually felt uncomfortable in the West because their clothes weren't considered fashionable enough, or the drinks were too expensive in the West, which I think's criminal. That's horrible. Expensive drinks in a gay bar, guys. Fuck that. But the GDR actually matched the West in institutions. They had dance bars and bathhouses and gay magazines. But there was a big difference. The Christian Democrats who ruled the West German nation were actually very anti-gay. I know, the party that's in power right now is very anti-gay. And would actually regularly raid gay spaces. Well, that was kind of not really heard of in the GDR. They had better things to worry about than like hardcore moralism. And paragraph 175 eventually becomes a topic again in East Germany, primarily due to gay communist Dr. Rudolf Klimmer. So Klimmer developed an association with the Scientific Humanitarian Committee when they were kind of a big thing, and he hid his political views during the Nazi era and his sexuality, and actually married a lesbian so they wouldn't be detected, and they survived. And after the war, he left his city of Dresden to go to the Soviet zone of Berlin, and he went to campaign for full legal equality of gays and a new institute for sexual science, and he got neither. But he was appointed as a medical director of Dresden's Polyclinic, where he set up the first marriage and sexual counseling center. So he made a difference, just not as radical as he wants. And he did have support. Klimmer actually had support from the Minister of Justice at the time, who had written in many legal journals an appeal to repeal paragraph 175. The cultural sector, which we all know has always been a gay hotspot, also had lots of support. facto, the Minister of Culture, poet Johannes Becker, just remained silent. He didn't condemn, he didn't promote, it was just silent. And the West Germany actually ended up revealing him to be gay because they're bigoted assholes and they hate East Germany. And it made him look bad. And that kind of shows like their attitude. In 1954, West Germany becomes a part of NATO, and their main goal is basically to combat the communism of the Soviet Union and the Eastern European allies. So they'll do whatever it takes to make Eastern Europe or Eastern Germany look bad. Yeah. But in 1957, despite all this, a judicial decision basically discontinued prosecutions on the basis of paragraph 175. The only exceptions were cases of assault, coercion, or minors. So basically all non-consensual acts. Other than that, they weren't really prosecuting gays anymore, which is awesome. On the other hand, in 1957, West Germany signed the Treaty of Rome, which created the European Economic Community, which starts building some capitalist unity in Europe because profit incentive, guys. And in 1961, the anti-fascist protection rampart, which we'll all know as the Berlin Wall, was constructed primarily to defend East Germany from the capitalist West. And this included walls, landmines, and fences. And basically was a result of the Cold War escalating and consistent efforts by the capitalist powers to destroy the GDR through economic sabotage, CIA subversion. They did strategic brain drain of the state-funded educated children. They took around 10% of the population by offering better benefits and more money, often to not always find out to be the case. And also like making them waste money to disadvantage their country and empower the West, which sucks. And also the West was smuggling far cheaper subsidized like resources from the East to the West, which slowed economic growth because this is all state run. They're trying to build an economy and the West is stealing it because they don't like how expensive their shit is. It's almost like capitalism sucks, guys. But also like conditions weren't that great for East Germans right away for labor. Like they had lower wages, they worked longer, there were scarcer consumer goods in the West. And the big thing why this was the case is the East didn't have the Marshall Plan the West did. The West got massive funding from the West to boost their economy. The East did not have that because all their allies were fucked by the Nazis. So the West also employed economic blockade on the GDR, which hurt them economically, which we still do today to other countries. Despite this, once they basically built the wall in 1961, the GDR was able to initiate the finalization of their economic goals and completely collectivize farmland and expropriate all the private stores and industry. So basically, socialism. They did it because they built a wall. Because most gay bars at the time were private, they became publicly owned. The bars were all publicly owned, and they still existed. At least one gay bar existed in every city over the population of 50,000 people, with the most in Berlin with like 5 bars and a steam room. And if you know, you know what happens there. Wink, wink. And basically the way they would work is the state-owned clubs would usually have straights in during the day and then gays in the evening. So, and also managers who weren't down with the gays would often just get bullied to be like, oh, I don't want to work here anymore. Can I go to a different bar? And I'd get ones that were more tolerant to the clientele. In 1968, paragraph 175 is officially repealed in the GDR as they adopt their own criminal code. And basically, homosexual behavior that's consensual, as long as everyone's 18 plus, good to go. You can put dicks in butts or whatever they were doing at the time. You can compare that to West Germany, who never actually abolished paragraph 175. A year later, they reformed it, so it only criminalized sex with anyone less than the age of 21, all gay prostitution was illegal, or the exploitation of a relationship of dependency, so like teacher-student stuff. So an improvement, but East Germany was better. And in 1971, the GDR achieved status of a developed socialist state. Now remember, Germany was one of the few industrialized nations in the world that actually got a socialist government, which is what Marx wanted. So they had an advantage. It was like one of the best countries economically for socialism in Eastern Europe. But it's also when the gay movement was founded. Once they hit this point, gays' rights took off again. And the next year, in 1972, the Berlin Association for Homosexual Concerns was created, where they just had discussion groups and films and book readings. They had talks by experts in psychology and sociology and medicine. Super cool. They like science guys, which is pretty cool. And the org was mostly working people as well as some professionals, and 2/3 of the steering committee was actually part of the Communist Party. In 1976, the group applied for state recognition. They didn't get it, but they did win some key demands. The group was able to get Berlin police to actually like really crack down on like hate crimes towards gay people after a bunch of gay people got bashed, which is good. And they also lodged complaints when one of the gay bars was closed by the government. And basically they forced the government to be like, oh, this is not an anti-gay thing. We're actually doing a massive urban renewal project, and we're going to create lots of bars and cafes so everyone's taste can be met, which is like, it's a pretty good response. I mean, that's pretty cool. 1976, Canadian historian Jim Steakley actually wrote about gay relationships in the GDR. And unlike the US and capitalist West, he states they actually were quite long relationships. Like they were like pretty long term. And he thinks one of the key reasons is because of the lack of competitiveness and anonymity. Is that what it is? Yeah. Anonymity. I can't speak.
Being enemies of each other.
Yeah.
Animus.
Animus, sorry.
No, I don't know what was the word?
ANOMIE.
The fuck is that word?
That's what they wrote.
We're twinks, Sam. Why are you throwing me words in?
But it was more an open, so I think that's what they meant. So basically all this was very surprising at the time because the GDR has one of the highest divorce rates on earth. It's around 50+%, which I know sounds really bad, but it's because all the women gotta stop being forced to be married to shitty husbands. So it was kind of good for women. But also pure monogamy was still pretty rare in gay relationships. There was pretty normal to have side relationships or even casual sexual encounters in the many public parks, the public beaches, which were known for nude bathing, as well as other public spaces like toilets and shit. It was pretty rare to have police entrapment, and public indecency arrests were pretty rare as well. So I think that's pretty gay friendly. The fact you can have sex in a park and not have to worry too much. Other areas like housing, which was only 10% of persons' out or income, is pretty cool. Gays were upset because since they were not recognized as having families, they were all viewed as single men. They could only get studio apartments. A key reason for this was almost all the housing supply was destroyed in the war, and they didn't actually hit like pre-war levels until like the mid-70s. But many were hopeful because of this that the government's construction would open up options over time as more housing was available and they kind of surpass pre-World War II levels. In regards to job discrimination, it occurred because people suck still. People will always suck. But gays actually did successfully argue their case in special worker courts, and they had jobs restore back pay for how long they were fired. They also had no actual threat of joblessness, as a job was a right for everyone who wanted one. So the state gave you a job if you needed one, a good paying job. yeah, so they had their material needs met, even if they weren't fully perfect. Well, in 1978, the Protestant church was basically given some concessions by the communist government to branch out outreach, and that basically resulted in over 200 groups forming under it on a number of topics, including LGBT issues, the environment, disability rights, and it also created a greater base for the church to pursue their evil anti-communist goals. The church is very tied into the capitalist class at this time. And as a result, most of these meetings, including the gay ones, had a lot of Stasi, or the secret police, in these organizations because they're really worried about imperialist influence, like resulting in their demise. Very important to remember. In 1982, the Evangelical Academy Berlin-Brandenburg held a conference called Can One Speak About It? Homosexuality is a Question for Theology and Pastoral Care. And basically their goal was to discuss how to reduce gay prejudice and also create space for LGBT people. A year later, after this, activists formed the Homosexual Working Group, which was connected with the youth section, actually, of the Lutheran Church, which I think is kind of funny, knowing like how churches treat gay people, but they had chapters in 20 plus cities. Despite all this, the Protestant hierarchy was still not a fan of gay people. They had strong ties with West Germany. It's more like it just helps with their interest. And the GDR did curtail their powers when they took power, but they did not seize the church properties, and they actually publicly funded pastoral training. So there was some give and take to like not just result in an instant revolution. Despite all this, most of the gays in the organization in the church were not Christian. Only 10% were Christian. It was more just the only place they could kind of congregate at the time to, build a movement in space. In the late 1980s, public discussion of LGBT rights as a result becomes part of the Communist Party and states discussion again, because they're like, oh, if we don't satisfy these people's demands, they're going to side with the imperialists, and that's going to hurt us. So they're like, we'll listen to you. We'll help you out. We'll do what you want. And they had conferences later on, which resulted in calls for making things more public, so it wasn't just professionals, and also that the state should sanction gay institutions, so create spaces for gay people to like improve their material needs. One of these was in 1984. The Humboldt University establishes the first German lesbian and gay studies research group to examine the conditions of the 750,000 people living in the GDR. The group actually stated how the clear lack of policy was leading to emigration, and also how intolerance could result in increased AIDS cases, which was becoming a thing, and also how the Communist Party should work to integrate LGBT people into the institutions. The communist government also did many of their demands. Like, they actually satisfied a lot of them through legal reform. They did more publicly funded research. They created clubs, and they expanded counseling and media campaigns. Lots of talking. But for example, in 1985, the state sponsored a campaign to eradicate all forms of discrimination based on sexual and emotional preference, and basically working to raise the social consciousness of the population on the topics of same-sex love. One of the ways this was done was having scientific publications and literature introducing like LGBT content in the forms like books and like sections of health magazines. There was over 200 articles published in the state press. They incorporated the topics into state radio and TV. They produced documentaries like The Other Love, and the state film company actually produced a film that was released in 1989 called Coming Out, which was about a gay teacher, which is mind-blowing, knowing like how people are so like, oh, the gay teachers will push the propaganda, but that's pretty cool. Social institutions also took on LGBT equality. For example, the Commission of Marriage and Family passed a resolution stating their network of counselor centers had a role in fighting discrimination and prejudice, and that same-sex love would later become included in public school curriculum, which was actually pretty cool. In their 1984 sex ed book, they had sections on lesbians and gays, including like pictures of like gay and lesbian like relationships, like mind-blowing stuff. And in 1986, the Gay and Lesbian Sunday Club becomes the first LGBT state-sponsored group, the first one to be recognized by the state. In 1987, the Supreme Court of East Germany officially struck down paragraph 151, which ended the difference between gay and straight age of consent laws. So, like I said earlier, you had to be 18 plus to have gay sex, but for straights it was 14, so they made it all 14, which to Americans might seem alarming, but that's pretty normal in a lot of Europe. But it's equal now. And the law was officially struck from books in 1989, so it's no longer on the records even. And in 1988, East Berlin actually makes discrimination based on sexual orientation illegal. So you can no longer discriminate against people based on sexuality. And in 1988, a national conference was actually held on how to include gays and lesbians in society, which included many speakers, and they called for a change of family law and recognition of gay couples and families. Keep in mind, it was still legal to be gay until 2000, in many parts of the U.S. until 2003, so decades ahead. In 1988, the military's like, you can be openly gay, we don't give a fuck anymore. So that's cool. And in a communist youth group, the FDJ actually was really into like LGBT rights. They produced radio programs on being gay or bisexual. They showed films and forums, and they even had a gay and lesbian social at their 1989 youth festival. And they actually directed members to go help gay and lesbian clubs emerge wherever they were needed. And they also forced members to attend educational sections on homosexuality and also attend different gay organizations so they can build solidarity, learn about the topics. Very cool, very gay. East Germany is very gay, guys. Sadly, it's coming to an end. In 1989, fucking Gorbachev of the Soviet Union starts weakening the socialist system through perestroika, adding some market socialism, which sucks. And they broke a deal with the imperialist West to basically say the USSR is not going to intervene if capitalism returns to any of the socialist Eastern European countries. This kind of left the GDR in a shitty place between the imperialists on the west and then Poland and Czechoslovakia on its east, who were sadly falling to color revolutions and returning to like a liberal capitalist system. In 1989, the Berlin Wall officially collapsed in response to protests, people wanting an improved GDR, but like many things, got hijacked by like capitalist counter-revolutionaries who saw an end to communism. And the collapse of the wall basically allowed imperialists to flood into the country. Like there's no longer this protection. And the economy became open to capital, became a deindustrialized wasteland, and unemployment shot up 50% of population. Crazy when jobs were a right for everyone prior. And also the economy was growing and guaranteed material needs for everyone. So this kind of stopped all of that. And basically from 1989 to 1990, the worker state was overturned officially, and the GDR was handed over to West Germany. This meant workers lost their free nationalized healthcare and education. They lost their low-cost housing. They lost their right to jobs. It also meant gays and lesbians were now under the reformed paragraph 175 again, which is a fucking blow. And people like transsexuals were also really worried about the loss of government-sponsored sex reassignment surgery for adults. They had the right to marry and adopt children in the GDR, and in some cases, they even actually won custody of adopted kids after divorce. So I know we didn't talk a lot about trans people, but they actually had many improvements as well, and they were worried about reunification. For West Germany, only parties that really supported gay rights during the Cold War era were the Free Democratic Party, the Social Dems, and the Greens. Once the Cold War ended, though, the Social Dems basically had a major electoral success, and LGBT rights started to advance in Germany. 1990, East Germany becomes incorporated into all the European community organizations, like the European Economic Community. So they're kind of being tied to like this new capitalist order. And in 1990, discrimination against gays and bisexual men was banned in the military, even though East Germany already did it. But now West Germans are free as well. And in 1993, the Treaty of Maastricht comes into force, which establishes the European Union, which was kind of constructed by Helmut Kohl of Germany and Francois Mitterrand of France. And basically this created the Eurozone, which was actually planned to incorporate eventually the former communist countries of the East, as well as establishing a euro currency, which eliminated national currencies. And as you might know today, now it's 27 members, including most of the fallen Eastern Bloc. So great. But in 1994, paragraph 175 was actually fully repealed. It's gone. It's no longer on the books. In 1999, Germany signs the Treaty of Amsterdam, which shifts certain powers from national governments to the European Parliament. So we see kind of this system that removes sovereignty in a lot of these places in the interest of, we'll say, liberal freedoms, but actually it's economic capital, guys. Perfect. And in 2001, same-sex registered life partnerships were legally recognized in Germany. So same-sex marriage was delayed, though, because the Christian Democrats, which Angela Merkel's part of, were like, no, we're not going to do that. So there's no marriage yet. In 2002, Germany overturns all convictions for homosexuality made during the Nazi period. Funny it took that long, but... and in 2004, same-sex couples could legally adopt children, but only if they were stepchildren, because we can't just let any children. That's bad. In 2006, the General Act of Equal Treatment passes, banning discrimination based on sexuality or identity in employment, education, health services, and goods and services. This was a requirement for signing the Treaty of Amsterdam, but was delayed for like 6 years because the ruling party wanted to get the language right. So they delayed this policy. And in 2011, the Supreme Court ruled the 1980 law to change your legal sex for trans people no longer can require you to be sterilized, which trans people had to deal with. And also you didn't have to have gender reassignment surgery to be legally recognized as the gender you wish. And in 2016, the Justice Minister announced that homosexuals convicted after World War II, so post-Nazi power, would have their convictions overturned. This became proved in 2017, and they pardoned 50,000 people, and gave them I think it was 1,000, 1,500 euros, something like that, for compensation. Really makes up for the prison. In 2017, the Social Dem Party introduces a bill to legalize same-sex marriage. This time, though, Chancellor Angela Merkel changed her mind and was like, you know what? I'm going to let the Christian Dems vote their way. They can choose how to vote. So the more moderates actually got the vote how they wanted versus how the party line was. The bill passed with support from the Social Dems, Greens, Die Linke, who's like the far left party, and 75 members of Christian Dems. This also gave same-sex couples full adoption rights, so they could actually adopt children. And in 2017, the federal court ruled a third gender option must be available for intersex people. This became law the next year. And actually, prior to that, in 2013, they didn't force you to mark a box if your child's gender wasn't clear because you don't know. They didn't want to like predetermine that shit. And then in 2020, conversion therapy for all children and any conversive conversion therapy for any age was made illegal, except it had no support from the new far-right party Alternative for Germany. And that kind of leads to today. I mean, you all know Germany's a pretty cool place for gays, but who knows what it would have been like if it didn't get toppled and become capitalist and shitty. But until next time, guys, we're going to talk about the People's Republic of China next episode, so stay tuned.
It's Gaylag Archipelago. It's Sam doing Gaylag Archipelago. It's just Sam doing Gaylag Archipelago. Is that Twinger theme?
Love it. Thank you, Gian.
Thanks.